Generous no more. The US is cutting the United Nations budget by more than $250 million. But why is Washington squeezing the UN? And what are the long-term implications of this cut? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hashem Ahelbarra. $285 million. That's the amount expected to be slashed from the UN's operating budget next year. The United States says it's negotiated the cut to eliminate what it calls inefficiency and overspending by the organization. The US ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, said, "We will no longer let the generosity of the American people be taken advantage of or remain unchecked. We'll continue to look at ways to increase the UN's efficiency while protecting our interests." The move comes after a tense week for the UN. The General Assembly voted to condemn the US decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital and move its embassy there. Haley responded by threatening to cut funding to the UN.
America will put our embassy in Jerusalem. That is what the American people want us to do. And it is the right thing to do. No vote in the United Nations will make any difference on that. But this vote will make a difference on how Americans look at the UN and on how we look at countries who disrespect us in the UN.
President Donald Trump has long been critical of the United Nations. Almost exactly a year ago, before officially taking office, he tweeted, "The United Nations has such a great potential, but right now it's just a club for people to get together, talk, and have a good time." So sad. That comment really underscores Trump's decision now to scale back on an organization the US has played an influential role in since it was founded in 1945. The official headquarters was set up in Manhattan in New York. It seats the main parts of the UN, including the General Assembly and Security Council. The US is one of 5 permanent members of the Security Council, along with China, France, Russia, and the UK. All 5 have veto power. The US is, of course, the largest financial contributor to the UN, providing 22% of its regular budget. That's well ahead of the other member countries. Japan comes in second with 10%, followed by China, Germany, France, and the UK. Let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Edinburgh, Peter Anthony Gallo, former UN investigator. In Comworth, England, by Skype, Rosa Freedman, Professor of Law and Global Development at the University of Reading. And in Delaware, in the United States of America, by Skype, Lawrence Korb, former Assistant Secretary of Defense and Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress. Welcome to you all. Let me start by asking Mr. Korb this. Do you think that slashing the US contribution to the UN is Trump saying, "I'm delivering on a campaign promise," or is he just delivering on a threat he made following the United Nations General Assembly vote on Jerusalem?
I think it's a combination of two. As you pointed out, he did say that the UN wastes a lot of money but during the campaign, and then when they had the vote on approving the U.S. Setting up its embassy in Jerusalem, he said, if that doesn't go the way we want, we'll take a look. So it's a combination of two. But it's important to keep in mind, it's not cutting the U.S. contribution. It's cutting the overall UN budget by $285 million. The U.S. pays about 22% of that. So this is only going to save, if I can use that term, the U.S. about $60 million.
Mm-hmm. Ms. Freedman, how significant is this decision, to cut the overall budget by almost $250 million?
Well, let's be clear. The Secretary General announced in October that the budget would be cut by $200 million, much of which was going to be taken from the Haiti peacekeeping budget, because the peacekeeping mission has now been changed into a rule of law mission, and from the peacekeeping operations in Darfur, as well as administrative cuts. Mm-hmm. And the US in June had wanted actually to reduce its funding to the UN significantly, and Congress voted that down. So actually the amounts of money we're talking about here aren't as big as Donald Trump is trying to make out. And these aren't such new plans in the way that he's trying to posture.
Mr. Gallo, this is something that comes against the backdrop, as we said, with the latest statements made by the UN ambassador to the US ambassador to the UN, and also Donald Trump saying that we will keep watching the UN and we will act accordingly. Is it legitimate to use the power of influence to try to enforce change in an organization like the United Nations? Or do you think that using coercive measures could sort of backfire in the near future?
Well, I think that all the member states use a degree of coercive measures one way or the other to bend the UN to the political will that they wish to pursue. I don't see that the United States is being any different whatsoever in this regard. It's just that the UN relies very heavily on American tax dollars, and they've, on this occasion, they have a president who has essentially the interests of the US taxpayer at heart.
Mr. Korb, the US president has said in the past that the UN is a social club and that it's been hijacked by people with, who are not big friends of the United States of America. I mean, we're talking about $500 million. Is this something which is going to have a significant impact on the running operations of the United Nations and particularly its peacekeeping missions around the world?
Well, the peacekeeping budget is separate from the budget that they cut. They cut the overall UN budget. So, you know, that budget is about $7 billion a year, of which the United States contributes about 28%. But we don't really have, you know, many peacekeeping forces involved at all. Other nations are doing that, which protects our interests. And this whole idea that somehow the UN doesn't support our policies, it makes no sense. Right after this, the blow up over the moving the embassy to Jerusalem and the vote on that, right after that, the United Nations voted the Security Council to put more sanctions on South Korea, I mean on North Korea, and that, of course, is the biggest threat to the United States and the world right now.
Ms. Freedman, I mean, there's no question everyone is talking about the need to tighten the belt of the United Nations, I mean, and to tackle the issues of mismanagement and mismanagement. But how can you implement the reform of the United Nations? What are the priorities? Because each and every major country is talking about a different set of priorities.
Well, let's be clear. All of the major donors are constantly trying to reduce the UN budget. Japan tries to, China, particularly around the human rights budget, tries to reduce down the money given. But at the same time, the 193 member states expect the UN to be fit for purpose and to be able to provide solutions to current challenges. And I think one of the key areas of reform is to try and look at what are the challenges today around climate, displacement, internal wars, the way that governments wage wars on their own people rather than transnational wars. And any reform of the United Nations and any changes to budgets has to be done with an eye towards what's coming and what's looming, not what's happened over the last 7 decades and all the successes the UN has achieved over that time.
Mr. Gallo, since we're talking about a new political order, a new era, fast-moving situation around the globe, what do you think should be the top priority? Is it climate change? Is it the technological reform? Is it education? Is it ending conflict and autocracy in the different parts of the world? What should be the top priority for the UN right now?
Well, those are international diplomatic and political questions I wouldn't like to venture an opinion on. But I think there's a danger here that we're confusing the political with the administrative. The cuts to the UN budget are not going to have a significant effect on the politics of the member states. What they will do is have an effect, whether it is significant or otherwise. They will have an effect on the running of the UN Secretariat. What the budget cuts have done has given the Secretary General the problem of how to make savings. And the culture of the UN being what it is, that actually is very difficult. They're not used to it. The managerial abilities within the organizations are not geared towards making savings.
Yeah, Mr. Korb, but since we're talking about a slash that could potentially affect the administrative aspects of the part of the United Nations, many people are still concerned that against the backdrop of the general sentiment pushing for a massive overhaul of the United Nations, people are concerned that ultimately, those who will be affected by the end of the day would be the conflicts that we're seeing flaring up in different parts of the world.
Well, there's no doubt about it. In fact, if you were to tell most Americans how much the UN budget is, they would probably say $600 or $700 billion. It's $5 billion. So it's not that much when you got, as my colleague said, got 193 nations, the problems that it deals with. I just mentioned North Korea, all the peacekeeping operations around the world. If those were not going well, you would have more terrorism, you'd have more threats. I think what we need to do as the United States, as the leader of the world, is emphasize what we get for that money. And the idea that we're paying too much is not. We've got about 28% of the world's gross domestic product. We contribute 22% to the UN budget. The EU in total contributes more. They contribute 30%. So this idea, I think if you were to tell Americans, they think we're funding it, almost all of it, and it's several $100 billion. No, it's a great bargain. Is it inefficient? Yes, every government operation is inefficient. I used to work in the Pentagon. We were not known for our efficiency, but those brave men and women can go out and perform well on the battlefield.
Okay, Ms. Freedman, I mean, what is the problem here? Is it the need for the UN to reinvent itself, or the UN to recognize that it has failed to tackle issues of spending and management of the funds allocated to it?
I agree with both of my colleagues on this, that the problem isn't the activities that the UN undertakes. It undertakes really important work that saves lives and that makes the world a better and safer place for us all to live in. Yes, there is bloatage within the Secretariat and within funds, programs and agencies. Yes, people shouldn't have to have the choice to travel business class when they're flying a few short hours away. Yes, it's a very strange culture where no one ever gets fired from the United Nations. But that's about addressing the internal problems. Shaving $285 million from the budget won't address those internal problems. There needs to be an organizational change and a culture change to address those problems. What's going to end up happening is that money will be taken away from very much needed activities around the world, rather than being used to ensure that pensions aren't far higher than pensions you would find in public sector elsewhere.
Mr. Gallo, as you've been a United Nations investigator, from your experience in the field, do you think that the issue now is for the UN to give more power to the bureaus and the staff which is deployed in different parts of the world, give them more say in running their own operations and their own budget?
No, it's not a question of giving them power. It's a question of holding them accountable for the power that they already have. The sums at question, in the great scheme of things, are not really significant. The UN budget is running at $13.4 billion. Now, all organizations lose money to fraud, waste, and abuse. If that's only running at 10%, we're still talking about a fraud risk to the tune of $1.3 billion a year. 285 is basically 20% of that. Right? It's not the control from the top that's the problem. It's the accountability for the money that is spent and the decisions that are made. The solution to every problem presented to the Secretariat is always to create more posts and more positions and another committee, without actually ever dealing with the substance of the problem that is there, because that would actually require a decision. The UN is very good for administration. There's plenty of administration. There's just no management.
But then this brings us back to the question of how to move forward. I mean, how to implement the reform. Mr. Korb, the decision-making process in the United Nations is controlled by the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, and each country has different agenda, different says about how to move forward and where to start the reform of the UN. Doesn't this leave us with a big hurdle?
Well, I think, in terms of what we can do is maybe have the 5 permanent members bring in an outside, firm to take a look at the efficiency of the operation and suggest some cuts. But the way in which President Trump is approaching it basically says that the United States is not getting, its money's worth here. The United States is paying more than its fair share. Those things, I think, need to be emphasized. Yes, if there are inefficiencies, if we brought in a management consulting firm, maybe we could find things. We just did in the Pentagon. We brought in a Defense Business Board, and we found out they're wasting $25 billion a year on excess overhead. Maybe the UN is doing that, but you don't want to cut into the core missions. And the idea, as my colleague just said, if you count the regular budget and the peacekeeping, budget, it's, $13 billion a year. That's pretty good, particularly when you include all of the peacekeeping there. That's a pretty good bargain for the money compared to some of the other things that you have to spend money on. So I think it would be good to bring in this outside group, let them take a look and maybe suggest some efficiencies. But we need to emphasize we're the ones who started this in the United States. And the idea that somehow or another it doesn't support our interests is not true. Do they agree with us on everything? Of course not. They don't agree with any country overall. But the fact of the matter is it has been good for us.
Yes. Ms. Freedman, this comes at a time also when emerging powers say that they would like to join the club of the permanent members of the Security Council, and that their presence would be an added value to the United Nations that could bring forth a genuine reform to the international body. Do you think that this could be the case?
I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding about where the power lies in the UN. Of course, the 5 permanent members have the power within the Security Council, but the 5th committee that controls the budget has great power at the United Nations. And we've seen recently, first of all, with the vote on the International Court of Justice judge, more recently in terms of the Jerusalem vote last week in the General Assembly, that there's significant geopolitical power within the General Assembly itself, even if it's not a binding body. And I think that when there's so much discussion focused only on Security Council reform, we forget the importance of all of the other bodies and the roles that these emerging powers do play there. So while it's important to think about should Germany sit at the Security Council as a permanent member, should Japan sit there with a veto or without a veto, these are only tinkering around the edges. If we want to think about reforming the UN as a whole-scale operation, we need to look at all of the main organs, and we also need to look at the Secretariat and how we appoint the Secretary General. Because if we're talking about management and accountability and transparency and leadership, then the way that the Secretary General's been appointed and the recent appointments, both this current one and the one before, have not appointed people who are going to come in and really reform the body and hold to account the senior managers across the board of the funds, programs and agencies.
Mr. Gallo, the UN has its oversight office that looks into issues of mismanagement, issues, reports, evaluates the situation across the globe. Ultimately, the United Nations General Assembly is the one that has huge powers, each country with one vote. Do you think that at this level, the level of the UNGA, we can start the attempt to try to bring about more accountability to the way money is being spent within the United Nations?
Absolutely. The General Assembly does not actually get involved in the direct oversight, the supervision of the funds and programs of the UN Secretariat at all. And that is basically left to, to the Secretary General and his senior staff. And they are the ones who are the greatest obstacles to reform. They are the ones who have a vested interest in maintaining the situation as it is, dealing with every problem by creating more senior posts. It is a self-perpetuating oligarchy. Now, when the organization was set up in 1945, it was an entirely different creature. What has happened in the years since is that de facto recognition as a state now is membership of the United Nations. So the idea that the UN was an organization of the peace-loving democratic nations has basically passed into history. And what we have now is a secretariat which is acting as a political entity in its own right. And that was never what it was established to do. The Secretary General was never intended in the Charter to be some kind of leading international diplomat. He was the chief executive of the administration.
At a time when people are saying that if the UN continues neglecting or denying the fact that it faces massive problems, other organizations, particularly regional organizations, will just step in and fill in the void, like the African Union, for example, which is now taking an aggressive role in areas where the UN failed. Isn't it something that could further erode the image of the UN globally? Well,
there's no doubt about it. And you have to ask yourself, why are these regional organizations stepping in? Can they handle the problem better? Is it because the UN is too inefficient or does not have the support that it needs? But they can work together. I mean, when we started the UN, we did not have a lot of these regional organizations, for example, like the European Union, the African Union. But I think a good leader, a good Secretary General would be able to work with these organizations and get more efficiency by relying on them for things they can do better than the United Nations can. Mm-hmm.
Ms. Freedman, I mean, the Secretariat ended up being an institution of its own, resisting the need to start a genuine reform. But then ultimately, isn't this something that raises the question of what kind of UN we need for this new era? Isn't this the real problem that we're facing right now?
I think a big problem is that the Secretariat is there with 193 bosses, but as has already been said, has become its own sort of political organ and makes its own decisions within that umbrella of what the 193 states tell or ask it to do. But the Secretariat, in many ways, is stuck in the past. It's backward looking. We see that reform only happens, for example, in peacekeeping, where a massive atrocity or crisis happens, and then the United Nations has to look inwardly, thinking about Rwanda or Yugoslavia, and address why that crisis occurred. And it's only at that point that reform comes about and that we make serious changes that make significant improvements on the ground. At the moment, there are countries that are being severely impacted by climate change. There's big technological problems. There's big internal armed conflicts that are going on. And yet the Secretariat hasn't faced a crisis point that will make it look internally and think about those reforms. And in terms of the countries that are being affected, most of those don't have the geopolitical clout to push for genuine reform within the Secretariat.
Mr. Gallo, give us an idea about, given your experience at the UN, what is the problem? Is it when we are assigned to look into issues of mismanagement or irregularities, you send your report back? Is it shelved? Is it overlooked? What is the problem? Why the mechanism does not seem to work properly?
In many cases, simply dealing with inefficiencies. It is the organization itself which is stifling the reform. It is the organization itself which is not interested in looking, for example, at procurement fraud. Now, if you want to make $285 million worth of savings in the United Nations, you could do a lot worse than start simply on that question. Why is there the lack of interest in looking at the interface between the organization and the private sector supplying it goods and services? All right. There was the procurement task force several years ago, which was closed down for political reasons, and the organization internally fell over itself in its enthusiasm to close down those cases that they already had. More recently, when my former office looked at cases in Somalia, and were discovering fraud losses to the extent of 70% and 80% of the money being supplied to NGOs in that country. The organization's response was basically to drop it, look the other way, close those investigations and not move forward. So now, the fact that there was money on that scale is not the volume of the money which is being spent, which is the problem in the UN. It's the location as much as where it's going. And Somalia was a classic example of that. We found evidence of UN funds being embezzled or otherwise being diverted into a terrorist organization. And the only thing the organization was interested in doing was suppressing that information, because if it was revealed, the member states would be less willing to donate funds into that program.
The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres.
There's a lack of accountability, which...
I see your point. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said that he's going to bring back accountability and transparency to the organization. Let's see how that will happen. Thank you very much indeed, Peter Anthony Gallo, Rosa Freedman, and Lawrence Korb. Thank you for your contribution. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem Ahelbarra, and the whole team. Bye for now.